Welcome to Transformation 2.0, the podcast for change leaders. My name is Chamara and in each episode, we bring you real conversations with executives, innovators, and experts who are shaping the future of business. Whether you are leading a team, scaling a company, or navigating the challenges of transformation, this podcast will provide you with insights, strategies, and inspiration to drive meaningful change. Join us as we explore what it takes to lead, adapt, and thrive in an ever-evolving world. Let's get started. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Transformation 2.0. I'm thrilled to welcome Taural Rhoden as a co-host to the Transformation 2.0 podcast. Taural, it's fantastic to have you join the podcast regularly to share your insights and experiences with our audience. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I feel honored that you asked me. I'm looking forward to the conversations.
For those meeting Taural for the first time, he's an accomplished leader with a wealth of experience in strategy, digital transformation, innovation, and program delivery. Taural currently serves as the principal and owner of Rhoden Consulting, where he helps experts think commercially to take action and grow, leveraging data-driven strategies to unlock growth and innovation. He's held multiple roles with the US Army, Mercedes-Benz, DXC, and IBM before focusing on Rhoden Consulting. He's lived across multiple countries, United States, Germany, and Melbourne, Australia. Throughout his career, Taural has guided numerous organizations through the complexities of digital transformation, specializing in strategic leadership, emerging technologies, and organizational growth. His deep industry knowledge and strategic insights make him an ideal co-host for our regular discussions. Taural, thank you again for joining as a co-host. Your perspective and expertise will undoubtedly enrich our conversation and inspire our audience. Today, we'll discuss doing uncomfortable things. Let's dive in.
Well, that was a very complimentary introduction. Thank you very much. I don't think I've felt so flattered in a long time.
I'm glad you liked it. All right. So the first topic that we're going to be touching on is talking about embracing discomfort to accelerate transformation, because I'm sure we know change is never comfortable, and especially change that's driving a transformation of where we are working, where we are living, our personal lives. That makes it even more uncomfortable. So we'll start a little bit about discussing this topic. And we've got a few other topics that we're going to be discussing, but let's start here, Taural. So,
good. I think what's interesting about it is we find this concept applicable across a variety of domains. So if you just think about physical health, for example, discomfort with working out regularly, growing muscles, it's a well-known mechanism to help one transform oneself from, someone who's perhaps not so sporty into someone who's sporty, someone who's not a runner into someone who's a runner or power lifter, that type of thing. So we're familiar with it in that context. But you see it also in the context of, obviously, organizations. You see that in the context of individual when it comes to learning. Oftentimes learning, although fun, can sometimes be a bit of a drag. It can be difficult. It can get frustrating. And so it's interesting to me when we were thinking about this particular topic, how you see echoes of this concept across, a variety of domains.
absolutely. And I think, you highlighted on the important point, right? Like personally, we navigate discomfort every day. The thing that I've often experienced is that, as individuals, quite often we are quite resilient in being able to navigate discomfort and be able to achieve change that, positively impact our lives. And to me, I think the thing that I've often found when working with the customers is that sometimes while individuals will embrace discomfort to improve their lives, when it comes to discomfort in a workplace that actually improves the business, we kind of feel differently about it, right? And to me, I think the thing that I've often experienced with that is that when it comes to changing the business, people can actually sometimes be a little bit fickle about navigating discomfort, right? And so for us, when we work with customers, that what we often try to do is we try to bring them into the conversation in a way that talks about yes, change is happening everywhere, but how do we actually bring that change into the business and explore sort of that, looking at how does this discomfort that we're feeling at the moment, how does that change what we do on a day-to-day basis, but at the same time, how does that change the business, and how does that improve the business, right? So for having those positive conversations about how it impacts our life positively, and also not forgetting, addressing the negative aspects as well, can sometimes be a bit of a way to navigate this discomfort in the business, right?
It's challenging to navigate that. I mean, I use the examples of individual transformation, and I think there's a compounding effect when you put individuals together into systems or in organizations, and it makes it that much more complex.
Mm.
I look at this as you're familiar with the Sinefin model, or Sinefin model. I'm pronouncing that probably wrong.
I think they pronounce it Canadian,
Kind
but
of
that's the Welsh pronunciation.
Fantastic. We'll go with that. But it starts from very simple to complex to chaotic.
Yep.
As it graduates up the scale.
Mm.
And I think most businesses, I think it's fair to say, probably sit in complexity.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have complexity, from a systems point of view, there's a gravitational pull towards, or a bias towards, homeostasis, like towards not moving, to just sort of they find whatever the balance is for themselves. And there is also, as organizations mature and grow, you find that there's a self-selecting mechanism for the types of leaders that you get. So there's a certain character or culture, sometimes people call it. And so what happens is people are familiar with the way things are done. This is how we do it. And what you find when you're driving a transformation as an organization is you're running against those forces of homeostasis. You're becoming an agent to try to disrupt things. You're pushing them into a disequilibrium, a discomfort, and you're running up against. People talk about the politics of an organization, but it's deeper than that. It's the way in which they're used to doing business. And I've sat in many board meetings where on one side the board members go, we would very much like the benefits of this piece of technology or of this way of doing things. Yes, we want to do that. They're not, however, comfortable with making the compromises or the decisions necessary to change their homeostatic environment into moving into the new thing, i.e. they don't want to go through the pain. It's, to take that simple analogy of, yes, I'd like to be a better runner, but I really don't feel like getting up in the morning at 6 a.m. doing the running, right? And it's when you're a change agent, I think, as both you and I are working in transformations across businesses, we run up against this on a regular basis, and it can get frustrating. And sometimes it's easy to sort of paint organizations as tied to their ways or lazy, or they say they want one thing but they do another. But it's really important for us as change agents, as transformation experts, to recognize that it's a non-trivial situation for them, and part of the change and the transformation, probably the biggest part, I always say, it's a people thing. It's never just the organization. It's never just adopting the strategy and executing it. It's never just implementing the technology. Each of those are discrete, complex things. It's really getting the organization, the complexity of these personalities, and shifting the way they've done it. That's where the pain comes from. Yeah.
No, I think you touched on three things in that. The first thing is we're wired for stasis. I want to come back to that, right? And then the second thing about the leaders, yes, they say they won't change, but when it comes to okay, in order to fund this, we have to reduce the budget somewhere. It's always no, not for my budget, right? So that. But I think, like, what you mentioned about thinking about it as taking people through the journey of change, and I think that's the important part that I want to come back to address first, right? Which is the methodology that we talk about in terms of the transformation 2.0. It's about how do we break things down into into a way that it reduces that cognitive impact for people to understand what's changing, understand how it impacts their work, their life, right? And by reducing that impact, we can actually get them to come along the journey easier than trying to drive a massive change into an organization. Because when you try to drive a massive change through an organization, then the impact on individuals is often quite drastic.
Mm.
And that becomes a point for people to push back against, because nobody likes big change, right?
Mm.
I don't want to go from waking up at 5:30 all of a sudden to actually waking up at 3:30 just because I have to squeeze in something new, right?
Yeah.
And it's the same thing. But if you go from 5:30 to 5:15, it's easier, right? It's not much of a drag on the body, not much of a thing for people to push back on, right? And I think that's why, Japanese talk about this kaizen and kaikaku,
Mm.
right? So kaizen is kind of like that continuous improvement, and then
Mm.
kaikaku is more sort of that radical change, right? And I think like with transformation 2.0, what we've done is actually we've built a model that enables kaikaku, which is that radical change, but we're trying to still drive it through continuous improvement and change in a way that aims towards that long-term vision of an organization. Just coming back to your point about most organizations and individuals are wired for stasis, I want to spend a bit of time discussing that, right? And I guess the first thing is, with 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 the pace of change that we're seeing today, is the mantra that organizations are wired for stasis still valid? What do you think?
I think it's demonstrably so. I think you simply have to look at the metrics of investment in so-called transformations and output, and outcomes.
Mhm.
Um, I remember when I first started, got pulled kicking and screaming into technology implementation, because I was a pure play business guy, and oh no, I do technology, and then I realized actually it's important to understand the enablement layer of technology. Way back in the early 2000s, that's when that happened. When I first made my first foray into those types of projects, and the inherited wisdom was about 80% of these fail, right? Or they fail because they go over budget significantly, they go over time. And surprisingly, shockingly, whenever I go back and revisit the stats from the various people who track these types of things, it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of change in terms of the success factors. It feels like transformational success is still quite marginal.
Mhm.
And so I don't disagree with the thesis that in order to be better positioned to survive and thrive in a much more complex and volatile world, you need organizations that can handle this type of thing. But I don't suspect that we're necessarily great across the board. There's probably different industries that are better. I think software technology is probably better suited for that type of thing, simply because the ways in which they communicate, the ways in which they work together, the readiness for uncertainty, the ability to iterate, decentralized decision making, all of these types of things
Mm.
to help people work better to drive non-tangible things. Software is a non-tangible thing.
Yeah.
Helps them to be positioned better, and just the tempo of that particular marketplace. But you go to talk to, I've got a bit of experience. You mentioned Mercedes-Benz, a bit of experience in the automotive world. And I recall talking to people who were, and this is just maybe less than 10 years ago, talking to organizations that sold the large trucks that you see, driving across the country, that they were still struggling to get people to use email in their sales teams, right? Everybody was doing things in fax,
Mhm.
strangely. So you have some industries that are certainly much more farther forward, but there's a long tail of industries out there that haven't felt the need to necessarily, um, move forward. So I think across the board, we're still quite bad at it.
I think you mentioned the important thing, right? Yes, some industries are good at driving change, some industries are bad. I think like the question I want to come back to
Mm.
in terms of digital transformation is that the organizations thinking of themselves as being wired for stasis, right? I think that's a model that's gonna really get challenged in the future, because as we go through digital transformation, what's gonna happen is everything physical it's gonna have an equivalent digital twin, right? So this digital twin essentially is gonna capture data in real time and get smarter and smarter with AI in the future, right? Because it self-supervised learning, right? And as it gets smarter and smarter, because what's going to happen is actually like these things are going to evolve much more rapidly, right? So if from that perspective, if we think the organization's not able to adapt and accept that change, then it's going to create a lot of tension, right? So I think the organizations need to think of themselves as being wired for change,
Yeah.
but change becomes the new constant, right?
I think so. You're talking about almost two different sides. One is what's our predisposition as human beings in organizations, in systems, complex systems, right? You can look at it through the organizational psychology lens. You can look at it through the systems thinking lens or whatever. But in either way, change is a disruptor. So change drives cognitive dissonance, in the words of the organizational psychologist. Change is a disequilibrium point from a complex systems point. Both ways, lenses that you apply, look at the human behavior, look at the human penchant for what they prefer in terms of how they work. And we simply do want to be, we want to have certainty to a certain extent, right? We don't like the uncertain. We want our behaviors to kind of fall into balance with other people. I just think that's a human thing. Now, can we change our organization structures, the ways in which we work together, the underlying technology which allows us to work together, to put us in a better position to iterate on change or be more dynamic? Absolutely. But I think there's still that very human factor in the system. Should we, which is the other thing you mentioned, should we be ready to do that? Well, yes, absolutely. We should be ready to do it. The world's not getting any simpler. The world's not slowing down. It's getting much more complex politically, sociologically, economically, all the lenses that you would apply, let alone technology. We talk about, you mentioned AI. I think there's some interesting, historically, we both of us come from a bit of a technology background. There's interesting examples or analogs about other types of really critical technology. You think about the push for centralizing systems for ERPs in general. You think about the domain of customer information and customer relationship management and how that's expanded into customer experience and all these types of things. Some organizations have been good at becoming customer forward and doing that. But I've been in the customer experience game for 20 plus years. And let me tell you, I'll still walk up to an organization and find that they've got very little understanding of where their customer data is, how to read it, how to interpret it, how to make a change in a way that's the best thing for the customer, right? This is 2 decades plus later. So if the technology can act as a prod or as an external factor to move things, it doesn't mean the organizations will necessarily follow along. So there's a difference between should and can and will, right?
I think you hit the nail on the head, right? This is actually what I was thinking about as you were speaking earlier. So I've got an 8-year-old, right? So I work with him every day to sort of get him to adopt better practices and give it a habit, right? But does that mean I should give him what he wants, or should I teach him what he needs to be a better person in the future, right? And I think the same lens applies when it comes to organizations and individuals, right? And then we all prefer stability, we all prefer comfort, because that's what comes easily for us, right? And I think the reason why I wanted to pick this topic was this is about dealing with discomfort, right? And that means, even though as individuals we actually prefer the stability and the comfort, in order to adapt to the future, the skill that we all need to develop is actually like how do we be comfortable with discomfort, right? And then how do we become comfortable with change being the norm, right? And I think if we come from a background where we don't want to adapt ourselves to change, then it's gonna make it really challenging for a lot of individuals in the future, because things are changing already. And if you don't have that mindset of, we all talk about growth mindset as being critical, right? And just growth mindset is critical. But also at the same time, I think what's also going to be critical in the future is this learning mindset, right? Because people are going to learn things so rapidly, and it's being able to apply that knowledge into something that creates value is going to be the skill that's kind of going to be coming at a premium in the future, right? So being able to deal with discomfort and then being able to deal with the change is going to be part of that, right? So,
I'd like to
what do you
unpack
think about that?
No, I agree. I think we're singing from the same hymn book there.
Yeah.
When I think about where does the discomfort come from, so it's probably worthwhile localizing that and thinking about it. So I've spent a bit of time sort of dithering on about, it's organizational, it's human, it's systemic, all those types of things, right? And to a large degree, the discomfort that comes out of that is the discomfort of the unknown. So I've been comfortable doing things this way. I understand what's done. I understand what's expected. I've sort of, I've followed into the patterns that, allow me to work here comfortably. And when those start to get disrupted, either through I've got to adopt a new piece of technology, or there's new reporting lines, or change to my job role, whatever. There's discomfort there for, the front line, the employee piece. For the management, there is, managers or, senior leaders are oftentimes working under different types of incentive structures. And so when the transformation, for whatever reason, comes up against the existing incentive structures, which have a very real impact to, let's be blunt, take-home pay, and their ability to be measured as successful, then it's pretty easy to see what happens there. Then you have, as you go further up the chain, you've got the incentive structures around the absolute most senior, the executive leadership teams. And again, they're under different types of incentive structures and different types of pain points for them as well. They might have to take a loss for, a quarter or a half a year, or even for a year or two, and making long-term investments where your business isn't demonstrating growth, particularly for a publicly listed firm, is a really difficult thing to do, because they're measured on these very microscopic scales of month to month, quarter to quarter, year to year. And transformation is intended to position us for longer term success. These are all areas of discomfort that I think everybody is aware of and everybody knows. I want to talk about the discomfort that comes about from those who are doing the change agents themselves, the transformation partners. So people like you and me, who are brought in externally. If you think about our incentive structures, one, we want to get the deal. We want to do the work because we want to get paid. And we also want to do a good job so we can continue to do good work and get paid. So our incentive structures mean that they have to align on one side with the interests, or the stated interests, of the client. But at the same time, if they're pushing back, where does one compromise? Where does one do? That's a significant area of pain for people who are working in this type of business. When you start to get hybrid teams of staff, partially external folks like us, maybe even one or two different agencies, and then you've got internal people who have been seconded to these transformation projects. I hate to say it, you don't always necessarily get the most dynamic, or the folks with the biggest influence or leverage in the organization to do it. And then you start finding that the pain points come across from a variety of different areas. So what I'm trying to do is paint a picture of, it's not just a single node. It's not a single aspect to be dealt with. One has to look at it from a variety of areas. And I've talked about incentives because that's sort of the mechanism I use to help resolve these types of issues. So when I go into an organization, I try to start aligning incentives and communicating with incentives and describing how we need to change incentives in the organization, formal and informal, in order to be able to drive a transformation. An example of a formal incentive structure would be what I indicated with senior management. Maybe you've got a compensation structure for hitting certain KPIs, and you've got to demonstrate certain types of things. All big businesses have these for senior leaders, right? That's a formal incentive structure. Informal incentive structure would be giving someone the role of system champion, right? You're introducing a new piece of technology. They get the training, they get the certification. They then are the champion for the system. They might or may more money from it, but suddenly they have an informal position, which helps to drive the transformation. It's a typical tactic that we use when we're trying to get organizations involved. That's another type of incentive structure. And so really going through and thinking about the incentive structures to at least address the most poignant or strongest pain points is a really, I think, important way to kind of dig in there. Sorry, I sort of veered into solving problems, but
I think it's kind of related to the next topic that I want to talk about, which is more courageous leadership in times of change, and discussing sort of some real world examples and practical strategies around how the leaders need to think about transformation, as well as dealing with discomfort in their organizations, right? So that's probably where I'd like to spend the next few minutes on discussing. And I guess for me, I think the important factor or point around this is that in order to drive transformation, you need somebody who actually has believes in the vision and knows how to drive that, right? And that takes courage, right? So what's your picture of a courageous leader that actually takes on the challenge of a digital transformation?
I will. So let's absolutely have a couple of folks that I've met who've been remarkable in their demonstrated courage in complex organizations and dealing with it. But I did want to note, just on the side, I think we in my words, I say we often over index on the leaders. Leaders play a critical role, but the teams, particularly the transformation team, have to demonstrate an over dimensional amount of courage in a difficult type of project. There's a lot of things there. So I just wanted to plant a flag for the teams as well. When it comes to leaders, I think there's that quote from Martin Luther King, which is the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort, but where he stands in times of challenge and controversy. And I think that's what it boils down to. You want someone, and when I think about leaders in transformation, I'm thinking about not the most senior executives who have made the decision to fund it and go for it. Yes, they're very important, but there is what you might call sort of the executive sponsor role that you oftentimes find. That's a senior leader in one of these complex organizations who says, it's important to me that we make this happen. I'm at a level where I have access to insight and ability to have conversations and move things that will inevitably get in the way. And why is this courageous? It's courageous because that means they're actively disrupting the status quo. If you're an executive leader in a large organization or even a medium organization, you've got relationships with the people around you and above you. And that peer-to-peer network, those relationships are critical for getting work done. And as soon as you start potentially disrupting those relationships by suggesting that the changes are needed, that transformation has to happen, you have to stop doing the way you're working, you need to share your budget, all these types of things. It can, for some people, feel like you're potentially ruining your political capital. It could also feel like you might be, going out on a limb because, let's face it, transformations have a high risk of failure.
Mm.
So if you're going to hang your hat on something and take the efforts necessary, you are you're taking a courageous step. Now, hopefully you're doing it because you understand the trade-off, you know what you're going for, you know how to be a good player in the organization to communicate and get things done. But it's no small feat for someone at that level to position themselves to be measured as successful or not in the eyes of their peers and the people, the ultimate reporting authority people they report to, and take on such an uncertain thing as a transformation, digital transformation.
No, spot on. I think, you mentioned about the teams and talked about leaders. And I think to me, I think that's kind of like two types of leaders. One is the ones that are more sort of executives that actually come with the authority and come with the mandate. But then you also find these other types of leaders who are actually people who might not have the mandate and the authority, but still they are actually change leaders because they understand what it means to actually try to change the organization. They understand how it's going to help make lives of everyone better in the end, but they take the effort to actually try and communicate it with the people around you. To me, I think those are the hidden leaders that we kind of really need to tap on, because more than the leader that actually has the authority or the executives that have the mandate, people who actually take on that leadership role, even though they don't have the mandate or the authority, but actually takes the effort to drive change in the organization, they are a lot more powerful because they'll often have a lot of network that they've built over the years. To me, one of the things that I found is actually being able to identify these people who are change champions. That's actually one of the key aspects of driving transformation or a change.
I totally agree. I wouldn't. I didn't. So I described sort of the senior stakeholder, the senior executive, starting from the top. But people who are leading and driving transformations, either from as an external coming into an organization, liaising with and hopefully enabling, a project manager, a change manager internally, or even more complexly, if you're captive to the organization, you belong to the organization, and you're hired specifically as a transformation agent. I always call those internal change makers. That's a really hard role. I think very similar to, but also with a much higher level, you talk about project managers oftentimes feel like they're in the hot seat. They're constantly getting crushed, right? From the bottom, from the top, from the sides, right? The transformation director or manager, what have you, the person who's really responsible for the day-to-day operations of getting it done, leading the team, and reporting up to the senior stakeholder who's the champion, that's a place where you get crushed if things don't go well. And it's a very courageous person who can stay true to the intent of the transformation, what's intended, but also do it in a way that's empathetic, uh, emotionally regulated. It's not an easy role, and I have
Definitely.
no qualms in saying I am glad I've graduated past that because it's been a very difficult part of aspects of my career. Not to say that the discomfort didn't teach me things and I didn't grow, going back to the
Mm.
first point, but I agree. There's a lot of courage in those people who do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the next area that I want to move on to is more just talking about the difficult conversations and the organizational resistance. I'm sure we've all faced this in our personal lives. I'm sure we've all faced this driving change in organizations. But what's one example that you remember that you can maybe dive into that we could discuss?
I think so. Yeah, this is a topic that I think is actually a culturally relevant topic.
Hmm.
And let's be fair, a lot of large transformations happening across geographic borders. In a country like Australia, where we both live, you've got a variety of multiple cultural team members, and how we approach communication, how we approach it is demonstrably different from culture to culture. I learned that vividly in Germany. Just as an example, when it comes to having difficult conversations, I recall sitting in, I was an internal consultant. It was my first professional role as part of, it's now called Mercedes-Benz Consulting. At the time, it was the Daimler Chrysler sort of internal consulting management training program. And they brought in some senior leaders from external consulting companies and decided to grow a consulting capability in-house so that and use it as sort of a training bed, but also not necessarily have to spend as much money on a lot of these other folks. So I was fortunate enough to be one of those cohorts. And I remember sitting in a meeting, and I don't remember the topic, but I do remember someone who was about as junior as me spoke up quite heatedly to the director of that particular group. And they went back and forth in a team meeting one morning for probably about 20 minutes. And I was, as an American, oh my gosh, what are you doing, right? And it was just kind of, they parked the conversation eventually because I realized it was probably out of place. But, that person didn't walk away from the conversation with any negative social impact. In fact, people afterwards were saying, "Oh, I thought that person had a really good point. It's really, it's good. It's good that they talked about it, right? It's good to hear that conversation." What that means is, and what I'm trying to illustrate is, there's a tolerance for healthy disagreement in Germany, and I learned that particularly in business, people have this ability to very clearly separate. Well, this is a business topic, and we'll put this to bed, and then we'll go out and we'll have a beer and we'll talk, whatever. That's fine. And what happens in business is very clear. It's rational. It's very focused, and there's an understanding that you need to be able to address difficult points head on, and there's a tolerance for that. Imagine my surprise when I came to Australia after 20 years in in Germany, in that culture, and having sort of really acclimatized to that, and then coming to my first transformation project in an Australian organization was different. It was very different. Yeah,
Mm.
the discomfort of being direct. I didn't realize I was really rubbing people the wrong way. I just thought, well, isn't this what we do, right? And I realized I had to learn. I probably learned it too late in that first business, but I realized, I needed to approach things a bit differently. So, yes, difficult conversations are important, but being more thoughtful about how to approach them, um, who you talk to ahead of time, getting feedback, all that type of thing was really important. So I know there's many things we can talk about having difficult conversations. I think the headline point is you have to have them. I think it's important in human relationships, and more so in challenging, volatile situations like doing a transformation project. But I did want to flag that intercultural piece, that you have to be sensitive to the organization you're dealing with. And although we talk about culture, I gave an example between English speakers and German speakers. The same is true in a financial services organization versus a tech company. I did a bit of work for a variety of tech companies in Richmond, and the way in which we communicated and talked to each other there was very different than when I would go to the NAB building or ANZ. Right, there's a very different way of communicating, and what's allowed to be said and disseminated upwards, etc. So difficult conversations must be had if we're going to be effective, but you have to be quote unquote culturally aware, organizationally aware of the right way to do that.
No, that's a great point. I completely agree. And I think the difficult conversation. I think Simon Sinek talks about this quite eloquently. Yeah, I think it doesn't matter how difficult it is. If you approach it the right way, there is always a way to try and get the message across. And I think, like, being aware of how it impacts the other people, how it impacts the other person, and then being recognized, being cognizant of that, and then building your strategy of how you approach the difficult conversations is the most important skill, right? Of dealing with difficult conversations. And I think, the obviously the difficult conversations and organizational resistance, they kind of go together, right? Because it's often the organizational resistance that kind of makes you want to have those difficult conversations. So and I think, to me, I think the thing that I've learned over the years is, when you see these organizational resistance to change or transformation, it's often not the 80% that actually resists, right? And the 80% is usually the people who just come along for the journey, depending on who's kind of driving the agenda, right? So there's kind of like that 20% that you want to pick on, that will be the key people that either helps you or completely shuts you off, right? So when you go into an organization, you want to be able to actually pick that 20% and then have the right conversation with them to try and get their buy-in and get their support. And then if you can do that, quite often the organizational resistance becomes easier to navigate, right? But being able to pick those people and being able to have those difficult conversations with them is actually like a crucial part of a change agent and transformation specialist,
100%,
right?
100%. Yeah. What you mentioned resistance, and I think one of the things I've learned is that resistance is information. Resistance,
Information asymmetry.
well, yeah, it's telling you something, right? It's telling you what could be resistance or defiance is fear, or there's confusion, or there's a need that's not being met, right? And understanding that, your job isn't to go head to head and win a rational argument. It's try to get behind where the resistance is coming from and see if you can do it. So I liked your point. I want to just loop back to it. Mapping influencers and the right people, the 20% who will help push, is really important. And then when you're dealing with the others, who might be pushing back, really trying to understand, what is it that I'm learning from the fact that there's a resistance here? What exactly is going on? And we find oftentimes people feel their identity or their role or their place of belonging is being jeopardized. And let's be clear, transformations too often mean people lose jobs or change jobs, right? So there's the very real fundamental fears that can be brought up through transformations. And so trying to understand it, not from the us and them, which it's easy to get into, and trying to be empathetic, I suppose, and trying to understand why people are afraid of what's going on, and then have those conversations. Yes, some transformations lead to people being made redundant. As an organization, how do we talk about that? How do we recognize that? Nothing's worse than telling everyone, there's a massive, people are building, there's sheets held up and people are building in the background and bustling. You can see something's going on. And every time you ask, they go, oh, nothing's happening. No, we're not doing anything. No, everything's going to be fine, right? And you can tell that, walls are being knocked down and stuff, right? I get a little bit irate when I find that people, particularly senior leaders, want to treat their employees and their staff members childlike, and wanting to, it's one thing to be careful about what you communicate in large organizations or an organization in general, because you want to make sure you're landing the right thing, and sometimes things aren't decided. It's fine. But I find it remarkable that we will spend a significant amount of time and money and effort in searching for really good people who are smart, who can do this good work, and then treat them like children by not informing them of natural things that are going on. And I think it's a silly thing to do.
I think you kind of touched on some of the important bits of the transformation 2.0 methodology that we apply in there, right? And I think that's about, yes, we plan the vision and the direction with the executives, but when it comes to executing change, we actually design the strategy and execute the strategy with the teams, right? So, and I think that's the important part, because if you go to this trouble of hiring smart people and then tell them what to do, you kind of wasted a lot of resources there, right? You wasted resources to find smart people. You wasted the resources to get value from these people in your organization. So the way to try and drive the change is to actually get the intent and communicate the intent, and then get the smart people to figure out what the intent means in their business, right? And if you let them figure out what that change means in their business, then it's often them that becomes the champion, because they know, yes, going from this role to this role, I need to learn these three things, and this is how I'm going to learn it, and this is how I'm going to apply it in order to actually add value to this new capability that we're creating in the organization. And
That's right.
and they quite often they'll come along the journey and they'll do the hard work themselves.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. I think looping back to the very first question around we were bouncing the ball back and forth about being able to be innovative, being able to change, being able to transformation ready in the future, that you have to do it. One of the key things I think that we forget, it's not just a question of adopting certain practices. It's not just a question of adopting a certain type of technology. To a large degree, it's an evolution in how we structure our organizations. It's decentralized decision making. It's decentralized structures, right? And we have these large organizations which to this day exist based on 19th century manufacturing or military structure, which due to the technology, the way in which we organized and orchestrated large groups of people, you needed to have that strong top-down way of doing things. Now we are way far beyond that in most organizations. I look at it as kind of a spectrum. On one spectrum, you've got a lot of ambiguity, you've got a lot of uncertainty. You need to have smaller organizational units that can make decisions, that can organize, self-organize as needed, depending on what's going on, break apart, free flow of information, all that type of, sort of modern ways of working. And then over here, you might have, process-driven types of organizations, manufacturing, particularly, right? So across that spectrum, it makes sense to have different ways in which one organizes, but I would still make the argument that even across the spectrum, even at the manufacturing side, an evolving of organizational structures and evolving of the way in which we work is important as well.
Absolutely. And I think that's, if you look at the organizational structures of businesses like Heya or BYD, this is what you will find. This is how they are actually different from a lot of the American companies. A lot of the American companies are still actually very hierarchical. So Heya has a model that you call micro enterprises. So their organization is essentially a collection of small organizations that have sort of clearly defined boundaries in terms of how they interact and engage. And by the way, the way Antosa is structured is very similar as well. But we can get to that conversation at a later stage.
That's interesting. I'm gonna have to dig into a little bit about
that Heya model is actually, it's called Rende and Hey, and it's quite a common model in terms of how to organize how to organize for change, how to organize for innovation, how to organize for empowering people in a way that you still have visibility in terms of how the end-to-end organization works, but then still gives the autonomy for different entities to actually do things slightly differently and adapt different practices and work differently. This is actually one of the things that we are putting out at the moment, working on. So with Transformation 2.0, it's more of a sort of a big change methodology, right? How to try change in organizations, large organizations. But what we've also done is actually we've applied some of the practices like Canavan or modally mapping or Scrum, Kanban, and strategic doing, and a few other different methodologies as kind of like method guides, right? So what it does is actually, if an organization is adopting Transformation 2.0 as the overarching change and transformation methodology, what they can do is actually for different parts of the organization, they can say, oh yeah, we're going to use Canavan in this part of the business because we've got a lot of people who are familiar with Canavan, who wants to use Canavan and are really passionate about it. So we will let them use that as the way to drive change in this part of the organization.
That's great. I love that.
Yeah.
I love that.
So we're putting out these method guides that will communicate quite shortly, but I think that concept of decentralization and try to empower people to actually do things differently, that's part of what we are trying to enable through Transformation 2.0.
Very good.
That's a bit of a segue in terms of what we wanted to talk about. But anyway, coming back to discomfort, and I think the next thing is about sort of some of the uncomfortable truths about innovation, right? We probably have time to discuss maybe one more topic, so let's pick that, or maybe let's go on to the next one, which is talking about personal growth as a catalyst for professional transformation.
Okay.
I know we touched on.
I do want to say about uncomfortable truths about innovation. Just there's a Seth Godin quote which I think sums it up
Oh,
perfectly.
is it? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
It's worth just thinking about, letting it marinate. If failure is not an option, then neither is innovation. I think that says everything.
That's a great quote. So just moving on to sort of personal growth and as a catalyst for professional transformation, and I think like we touched on this a few times. So because of that, I wanted to just come back to it and maybe sort of summarize it a little bit. What are your thoughts around it in terms of what we so far discussed, and anything else that you want to add to that?
When it comes to personal growth, you mean?
As a catalyst for professional transformation.
I think there's I'll answer from a very, very subjective point of view. And that is sorry. I'm caught up in a couple different thoughts. So look, one key point for me is I have observed, so when I was younger and I was operating in first the military and then in business, and you look ahead, you look at the folks who are more senior, it's not unusual to find, and this was true in the military, people who sort of slow down, they lose momentum, and they sort of stagnate. And I saw that in particular in some of the large automotive organizations that I worked in, as well as some of the consulting companies I worked initially. And it seemed to be that there was, a lot of work, and then eventually people get comfortable at a certain age, is what it felt like. And I never wanted to be that. I never wanted to be the person who sat back and said, well, I guess I know it all. And that sort of drove me personally to want to learn more, to experience more, to do more, to try more things. Now that I'm, that older guy with a gray beard, I am reminded regularly that although I've got a pretty good amount of international experience, I speak a couple languages, I've done business, I've done technology, I've done, creative endeavors, written books and, things. I still do not know it all. And reminding myself that I don't know it all and I shouldn't get too comfortable in my point of view has been a really critical piece for me when it comes to personal growth. And always being, having that, I don't like saying growth mindset because I feel like that's a piece of clothing that's been worn out. It means something, but for me, it's really just reminding myself, I don't know it all, and go ahead and seek additional feedback. Go ahead and try to learn more.
Now that's I think what you mentioned about growth mindset being an overused word. Yeah, I completely agree with that. To me, I think like what I usually like try to talk about nowadays is more sort of like learning mindset. So because I think if anything, what AI has done, it's made not democratized knowledge, right? So things that were really hard to find in terms of learning new things are actually a lot easier for us to learn nowadays because it's just a prompt away, right? and to me, like so as somebody who drives change, when I come across a concept that I don't know of, quite often what I do is actually I use the AI to actually learn about new things, right? So being able to understand something that you didn't know about and be able to, I guess, understand it sufficiently so that you can apply it in practice. That's the skill that I've kind of really value these days. To me, I think that's going to be a skill that a lot of leaders are going to need in the future because they're not going to know everything, but at the same time, they're going to be working with a lot of people that are a lot smarter, that have learned a lot of different things. If you really look at the sort of the new cohorts that are coming into workplace, they don't really shy away from doing anything just because they don't know. They quite have quickly sort of go and do the research and try to learn it, and then quite quickly come back with sufficient knowledge to be able to apply that. Right? And I think that's the for a lot of mature people that are kind of like looking at how is they going to adapt, how are we going to adapt into the future, right? To me, I think this is the thing that we all need to sort of think about. How do we quickly figure out how to learn something sufficiently so that we can actually apply it in practice and create value from it, right? To me, I think that's going to be a really important skill in the future. And I think like that's kind of the way I think about how to apply my personal growth as a catalyst for professional transformation, right? So Yes, like for example, when it comes to doing a podcast, Taural, I didn't know anything about doing a podcast, and then I think like if you talked to me 5 years ago, even a couple of years ago about doing a podcast, I would have said, "Nah, that's not really my thing," right?
Mm.
But when I had to do a podcast, what did I do? I actually went and like did a bit of research, tried to find out what it means. Yeah, okay, this is what it is, right? And then sort of like experiment with it, right? So the
Yep, yep.
first couple of episodes, we didn't have it nailed. Even now, I don't think I have it nailed. Right?
I think you just that last point you hit on is what I'd like to linger on and just elevate, because I think that's a really important point. My first answer was, a bit more subjective around, reminding myself not to get too comfortable. But I think the idea, the willingness to experiment, I see that as a critical success factor across multiple domains. When we started the conversation, I talked about how change is uncomfortable across multiple domains, right? And how you see that in organizations. That's true as well. So if you think about today, while I don't necessarily focus tremendously on a lot of digital transformation, I do a lot of focus on commercial work for people, helping them grow their businesses. That's kind of where my current passion project is at the moment. And one of the things that I see there is also people are afraid to take steps out to talk about the work that they're doing, to market the work that they're doing, to try to sell the work that they're doing, to get noticed doing for doing certain types of work, because it's not perfect, and they don't want to fail. They don't want to be seen as though. And there's a massive mindset shift which has to happen to become successful. Is everything is a data point of information. Everything should be teaching you and showing you what's working, what's not working, and helping you shape how you're moving forward. And I think that's a really critical part when it comes to the domain of transformation. Is you have to be able to take ideas, rapidly implement them, try them out, try them on, and see where they lead you. Having an organization around you that's accepting for that is really important. And those of us who are trained change agents, we don't want to just prompt people to do that. We want to help make it a more comfortable space, a more accepting space to get out and try, to innovate, to iterate, to experiment. Failure's fine if you learn from it, those types of thematics that we oftentimes talk about. So I wanted to linger on that point that you mentioned, because I think it's really critical.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually part of Transformation 2.0 methodology as well, in terms of how we experiment and scale. So the jumpstart and scale methodology that we talk about in Transformation 2.0, it's primarily around actually how we experiment on things and then get some proof points, and then how do we adapt it and scale it across the organization. So it's nice that you brought it up. Thank you for that thoughtful discussion, Taural. I really enjoyed speaking with you today, and thank you again for agreeing to be a co-host on this podcast. I look forward to having you on a few more episodes in the future on a regular basis, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Same to you. I look forward to future conversations as well. Thank you.
That's it for today's episode of Transformation 2.0. I hope you found insights that will help you lead change with confidence. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. Your support helps us bring more transformational stories to readers like you. Stay connected with us on LinkedIn, and if you have a topic or guest you would love to hear on the show, let us know. See you next time.